Hey there, I'm author Sarah A. Chrisman, and today I'm going to share the audio from another program I did recently. This one is on the history of the lawn. Now, if you'd like me to do a program near you in your locale, you can get in touch with us about how to do that through our website, thisvictorianlife.com. Just go to the presentations and programs part of the website. And otherwise, enjoy the show.
So, a history of the lawn. You know, it's actually a really, really recent thing that every home has this tiny little golf course in front of it. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back and talk about what lawn meant to people over the course of human history and how we wound up where we are now, where we have people, puttering around on their little tiny tractors, creating a golf course all the time. So, in the beginning, there was pasture. Throughout most of human history, when people talked about lawns, they were not talking about these exquisitely groomed tiny little mini golf courses that we now think of as a lawn. The word lawn first comes up in the English language in the 1500s, the 1540s to be exact. And at that point, it just meant a glade or open space in a forest between woods. So if you picture in your mind a glade in a forest, that's very different from most American lawns these days, isn't it? But that was what the word lawn originally meant in the English language. Comes from Middle English, from the 1300s, lande, and then from Old French, land. And at that point it meant a heath, moor, barren land, or clearing. So, if you picture walking up to your neighbor who is exquisitely grooming his lawn and putting, $500 worth of chemicals on it and saying, that's a nice barren clearing. For most of human history, people were not very concerned with grasses for aesthetic purposes. People were concerned with grasses we eat. Wheat, rye, barley, maize when we discovered the New World. And the people in the New World were interested in maize before we discovered it. But yeah, the grasses people were really focused on were the ones that did something for us, the ones we can eat. They did not care about, a little golf course. Golf wasn't even around yet. Now, the traditional mowing tool for those grasses we eat was the scythe. Picture the Grim Reaper coming along, mowing with his scythe. Has anyone here ever used one? Yes, okay. Tell us a little bit about what's involved in using a scythe.
It's fairly heavy but balanced, and swinging it, you can cut in a arc.
Right. And I noticed you're waving you've got some big muscles there, I notice.
It's a little different for some people.
Right.
A little awkward.
Right, exactly. I noticed some muscles on that guy who's got scythe experience, because it's very much an upper body thing. Now, men versus women, who has more upper body strength? Men, yeah. So, traditionally, mowing was the man's provenance. It was the man's area. And there were, of course, situations where women would have to bring in the crops, because if you've got a war and all the men are dead, you still got to eat. Or if you've got a widow who can't afford to pay someone to bring in her crops for you, someone's got to do it. And there are a lot of old paintings of women with scythes precisely because it was unusual. But for the most part, it was the men doing the mowing. Women were taking care of the gardens. And there were a lot of gardens throughout human history. You had a kitchen garden where you had your herbs, vegetables, fruits. You had a medicinal garden. This is where you grow all of the herbs for taking care of people who are sick. You had a dyer's garden. That's where you grow the woad and the madder for dyeing your clothes. Lots of different gardens, and women were in charge of all of them. They were also in charge of taking care of the small animals. Rabbits were considered part of the garden, and usually goats too. Actually, the interesting thing, just a side note, rabbits were considered poultry for a long time. Now back to the idea of the lawn as pasture. They were planted, these lawns as pastures were planted around castles. Well, not planted, just they were left around castles. And the reason that was done was because you wanted a clear line of sight between you and the enemy. Remember, the whole point of a castle like this is it is a fortification. It is somewhere you go and you bring all your weapons and you wait out the enemy who is out there wanting to kill you. So, in history, these bushes would not have been here around this castle. These would have been kept low by these little baa white sheep. And the pastures around the castles were being tended not by guys with lawnmowers, but by livestock. Here we have more sheep around another castle. And so when you hear about the beautiful lawns around such and such castle, remember that lawn at this point is the old lawn as pasture idea. And again, those trees are fairly new. These would not have been around back when that castle was in use. Same here. Lots of sheep. Okay. Now, the lawns that were a little more carefully tended were bleaching lawns. These are mentioned in the Bible, so they're documented really far back, a few thousand years. And what these were, they were bleaching greens where textile manufacturers would lay out the fabric to bleach in the sun. And there's actually a chemical process going on between the chlorophyll in the plant and the sunlight that actually bleaches it out. Now, Felipe over there could probably tell you a lot more than that because he's the biologist. So if you have any questions about how the specific chemistry of how that works, ask that guy in the hat over there. But these were usually common spaces where a whole town of textile workers would bring their fabric to bleach out in the sun before they sold it. And because of that, these were usually in textile towns. You didn't have these in every town. And by the way, if you've ever seen the textile that gets called lawn, it's a very thin cotton. That's why it's called that, is because it was bleached on the lawn. In the 16th century, you found very, very rich estates started doing this effect, which I just find charming. They would make very small lawns out of herbs. So you had a chamomile lawn. Here's what it looks like when it's not blooming, and here's what it looks like when it's blooming. Or a thyme lawn, not blooming and blooming. These are quite pretty, and also they smell wonderful. I saw a few of those in Europe, in some old estates. Okay, here's the guy that changes the whole story. Louis XIV, King of France. He ascended the French throne at the tender age of 4 years old. Now, at that point, France had been without an heir for 23 years. The old king had no son for 23 years. And then finally, poof, there's this boy that's born. So the whole kingdom of France was so happy, they called him Louis the God-given. Now, picture 4-year-olds you have known in your life. Picture that 4-year-old boy, his whole life has been hearing adults in positions of power call him Louis the God-given. Meanwhile, there's a bunch of other people in the court who for 23 years have been saying, hey, the king has no heir. When he drops off, when he's gone, I think we should take charge. And so they've got all these machinations going on, plotting about what they're going to do when the old king dies. And then suddenly there's this little baby who is the heir to the throne. They're not very happy about that. So what winds up happening is a civil war breaks out. You have the ones who want Louis the God-given on the throne, this 4-year-old kid, and you have the ones who want power for themselves. Now, in the meantime, you can't make a 4-year-old make decisions of state. No matter how traditional you are, you need someone else in charge. So his mother is the regent at this point. She's ruling for him until he comes of age. And the opponents who wanted the power for themselves they wind up capturing Louis and his mother, and they get imprisoned in their castle for a while. And they tried to get his mother to sign away her power in all sorts of ways. Louis grew up in this environment of being told he was this God-given ruler of France, but also seeing these people trying to kill his mom and him, incidentally. So, what this does to this young boy is in the first place, it gives him a really big head. He's very, very arrogant. He believes everything is about him, because he's Louis the God-given. And at the same time, it makes him super paranoid. So, when he ascends the throne and gets power for himself, he decides he's taken all the power because he is Louis the God-given, and also he is gonna crush those folks who tried to kill his mom. So he takes what was an old hunting lodge, Versailles, and he turns it into one of the, I'm not even gonna say one of, I'm just gonna say the most over-the-top villas in all of Europe. I'm leaving Russia out for the moment because Russia is its own thing. But Versailles is this incredibly ornate, incredibly over-the-top chateau where it's not set up for fortification, it is set up for show of power. The whole estate of Versailles, the whole chateau, is set up to send the message, I am so powerful, I don't need fortifications. No one would dare go against me, ever. And he makes all of his courtiers live there for a certain portion of every year. So everyone who's in charge and power in France has to come live in Versailles and be surrounded by just this excessive display of Louis's power. Has anyone been there? I've been there. Yeah. If you're ever in France, it is impressive. Okay, now part of that, this is this display of power. It's also a display of control. Everything in Versailles is sending the message, Louis is in control. He controls everything. Part of that control was not only was the palace just gilded to the gills, just covered in marble, everything. The grounds were just exquisitely groomed. So whereas the lawns around other castles were just grazed by sheep, they were there so you had a clear line of sight. At this point, Versailles has these exquisitely groomed lawns that were all about getting the message across to the courtiers of, I am so powerful. I have people who do nothing all day but just cut my grass for me in these exquisite little patterns all day, and I just have all of these serfs. I don't need them to grow food for me. Oh no, I don't need them to make textiles for me. I can just have people, not pay them, but that's another thing. I just have these people to cut my grass for me in these fancy shapes. Now, Jim asked, why is my lawn not like that? You're not Louis the God-given. I'm sorry.
I'll admit it.
You don't have a whole troop of serfs to do nothing but cut your grass for you. And remember, they're still cutting it with scythes and small knives at this point. So this idea builds of the manicured lawn as a symbol of power. And it spread amongst the super wealthy, the kings, and then the really, really high nobility. Now, because everything had to be done by hand, they were very, very expensive. Even amongst the elite, even among kings and high dukes, they were still the exception rather than the norm. Most castles still had that pasture around them, grazed by sheep, or if you were getting really fancy, they'd be grazed by deer. But you'd have to have a really, really powerful kingdom like France to pull it off. Now, a few years later, along comes this guy, and I love his name, Lancelot Capability Brown.